Light tonight on Eyewitness News Update.
This year, Channel 13 celebrates 35 years of broadcasting here in Middle Georgia, and it all started in this building right here. These are the original studios of Channel 13 on the old Cochrane Short Route. It's not used as a studio anymore. Now it's mostly storage and, of course, a lot of memories. Channel 13 and television have both come a long way in those 35 years, and what we've set out to do is give you a glimpse of maybe what it was like in those early years. For the next 60 minutes, we'll be talking to individuals who were actually here in those early years and who each had their own unique contribution to make to the success of what would become Middle Georgia's oldest television station. What we have is not presented as a literal history of the station, but probably more appropriately would be called simply a look back. 1953 is actually ancient history when measured in terms of a local television station. The television industry itself didn't get started too much before that. Back in those days, there was an incredible number of steps that you had to go through to give birth to a television station. And it's very difficult, therefore, to isolate or pinpoint any one of these steps as being the actual beginning of Channel 13. We thought that perhaps the best place to start would be on September 13th, 1953, when the first human voice was actually transmitted over Channel 13. That voice came from this very room here, and it belonged to Albert Sanders.
When a new television station came on there, they had to run a test pattern. Most people don't see test patterns today, but that's the thing that comes on the screen actually before the program starts and identifies the station. And by law in those days, perhaps still today, you had to come on for a couple of weeks and run your test pattern so people could gear their TV sets to the station. And we were going to start our test pattern exactly 2 weeks prior to the day we signed on. And this was also quite an event. It was, as I recall, 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And Mr. George Rankin and Mr. Wilton Cobb were very nice to me. They said they would like for me to have the honor to do the first official speaking on WMAZ. So it wasn't on camera, but I sat in a little announcer's booth and read about a full page of script. And I felt like the whole world was listening to me at that time, and was very nervous just thinking about the historic event. And I still recall that very vividly, sitting there doing that and thinking that maybe I was having some part in television history in Macon.
Down this way in the building were rooms that were full of film projectors, film processors, slide machines, all manner of electronic paraphernalia that were required to actually broadcast a television signal. This is a hallway which used to lead down to the reception area of the station. The main studios, though, are right through this door. Let's go take a look. This was the control room. This was where directors and audio technicians all did their jobs. And out here we have the main studio floor. It measures a mere 9 yards by 11 yards. And if you can imagine about 30 people all crammed into this space, all extremely nervous, trying to get ready to do something that they had never done before, then you might have an idea of how it was just 2 weeks later, on September 27th of 1953, and the first day of broadcasting at Channel 13.
The day we went on the air with television was one of the most dramatic days in the lives of most of us who were connected with it. You have to understand that television today is a thing that you take for granted. Macon has several stations today, but back then you had to get your television out of Atlanta with very poor signal quality And people in Macon just looked forward to the day that we could have our own television station.
You couldn't move around the station for the flowers. Everybody had sent flowers and congratulations and all, and they, when the lobby area filled, they started to bring them in the studio. And you were going to have a couple of bands, one right after the other, that did in order as the shows appeared during the day. And they did a little bit of each show for that day. And when you got it, 2 and 3 groups lining up in order, trying to get follow one behind the other, because everything had to be live. There was no taping and delaying or anything like that, and it was a real headache that day, trying to get it all in.
None of us had any experience with television. I think one person on our staff had really worked at a television station before, so it was a bunch of rank amateurs going on the air to run a television station.
We had people on camera, people on the boom, this, that, and the other. They didn't know anything about, you know, so it was all day Sunday this went on. If you could have seen the makeup that some of them had applied to them, it would have tickled you to death.
And we only had one person on the staff that had ever worked at a television station before, and only 5 that had ever been in a television station before. But we were fixing to start operating a television station, and we did. But you learn from your mistakes, and that's the way we learned.
We had never done a full sequence of, say, drop the network and run a commercial, you know, make a station break, and rejoin or go live or whatnot. We had never run the whole sequence of stuff. We didn't know whether it'd work or not until we started on there that morning.
So one of our men who had been working, he was working on setting up films, and we had a program called Theater 13, which was just a name to cover a bunch of films. We had so much time to fill up every day till we used a lot of films, and it was to be called Theater 13, and he got on and explained that he'd been working on this and everything, and then when he came to the title of it, he couldn't remember Theater 13, and so he had to turn around to one of us and say, "What's the name of the program?"
You know, if somebody said boo, you probably had a basket case on your hands because it was nothing but nerves. And with this statement about food rusher and where angels fed the tread, that was us, you know, because we didn't know any better.
And rush in they did, head first, into an industry that was really too young to have any hard-set rules or ironclad traditions to follow. And with the first day of broadcasting behind them, they set about to produce an incredible number of local programs that would be necessary to fill up a broadcast day. When we come back, we'll look at the results.
Place them in your oven, which incidentally has already been preheated to about 475 degrees, and 9 minutes later you get the fluffiest, the lightest, the finest textured biscuits you've ever baked. Another idea about puffin biscuits is the fact that they're economical. You actually get more for your money. Their versatility, their dependability, oh, when company drops in, what a grand feeling it is to know that all you have to do is bake 10 of these biscuits, perhaps wrap them around some Vienna sausage.
Straight from the heart, straight from the heart, we're coming straight from the heart of Georgia, Channel 13. From the heart of the people, the folks who really care, a past that's full of history, a future we can share. Spending days at honest flavor, taking pride in all we do. We're coming straight from the heart of Georgia for you. Faces filled with pride, friendship for a guide, blue skies up above, it's a life we love. We're all a winning team, we've got a special dream, and we're straight from the heart of Georgia, Channel 13.
Operation programming from the networks amounted to only a small portion of the broadcast day. And for the rest of the time, the station really was on its own. Now, probably one of the biggest challenges back then was how to fill up all that time, and as a result, an incredible number of local programs were developed and produced to appeal to almost every segment of the Middle Georgia public. On a program called Let's Find a Way, viewers were able to call in their questions or their problems and get advice and counseling from a panel of local ministers. School Today gave viewers a glimpse of classroom activities going on in the public school system. Children were entertained by Roy Hubbard as Pop Gun and Herb Johnson as Single Shot on the Western Theater. And probably the most remembered of the kids' shows at that time, the Jack and Jolly Show.
The Jack and Jolly Show was a monster that grew. It became much more popular than we ever thought it would, with the live children, the cartoons, Jack Owens and Bill Cook. By the way, his identity was kept very secret. Nobody knew who Jolly was. Wherever you would go, if anyone knew that you worked for WMAZ television, they would ask you, who is Jolly? And of course, everyone was sworn to secrecy.
And when he wasn't doing that, he wore another hat. He was the chief photographer, if I'm not mistaken, for the TV station at the time. And he was such a quiet, dignified, unassuming man when he was Bill Cook that you couldn't believe the transition that occurred when the man put on the suit and the clown makeup. He became a total extrovert and a total performer.
And he just flat refused ever to say anything on, you know, on camera, but he wanted to be on the thing. So, of course, he was in a clown makeup all the time, and he made signals and had the air horns that you pump or something or other that way, but he never said anything. And, of course, Jack is like me. He never stopped talking.
They got a lot of mail, and it seemed to have a great deal of appeal to adults as well as children. I still run into people who say, do you remember when I was on Jack and Jolly? So the studio was filled with a lot of children when the program was on the air. It's a very good show.
Viewers were entertained by programs like The Judy Green Show, and talent from all over Middle Georgia was showcased on The Bob Cox Show.
Really, it was a work of art. I mean, you'd see things that you wouldn't believe after you saw them do it. You wouldn't know how to do it.
One of the things that I remember in recalling the Bob Cox Show that seemed very unusual for a station like WMAZ, a local station, with very elaborate sets for this show.
An early one that I remember that we did, it was an RP screen of a river. I don't know, it could have been the Ocmulgee, it could have been Mississippi. But in the foreground, we set a couple of low branches from a tree. We also had some imitation pilings, like from a dock. And because we were not going to shoot the floor of the studio so it could be seen, we took a photographer's tray for developing pictures, filled with water, and shone a spotlight down into it, and then ripple the water so those waves of light would reflect on Bob Cox's face. So it was a very original, we felt, setting for a song, and looked very realistic.
We had tons of sand moved in one time for a beach theme for the show.
They had the whole deal, the girls in bathing suits, you know, the whole thing.
We brought in, I'm going to say, at least a couple of tons of sand and piled it on the concrete floor, and we made a beach scene right there in this TV station.
We had so much trouble with the sand in the studio after that show. Cameras would crunch as you roll them over the tiles, and it was just quite a problem. I seriously think that if we went back now, we might find some grains of sand still left in the old studio. It was that bad. Needless to say, the powers that be said no more sand in the studio. They felt that maybe you could get a little bit too realistic with it.
Housewives were entertained and informed by shows like For the Ladies, Nancy Carter's Cookbook, Coffee Break, and Hospitality House with Helen and Herb. And in 1959, regular viewers to the Country Carnival with the Smith Brothers witnessed the on-air debut of the station's receptionist.
I had been hired as a receptionist, and that's what I did out at TV, out on the Cockney Short Route. And one day, they were giving away free tickets. So the Grand Ole Opry was coming to town, some of the stars. And so people were sending in their cards, you know, to maybe win some free tickets to see them at the auditorium. So the day that they would pick out the winners, Smitty came out and said to me, Doris, how about coming in and picking out our winners on camera? And I said, hey, sure. So I went out on the set and picked the winners, read the names, and as Smitty in Tennessee talking back and forth with me, and I was very comfortable with them. Well, it so happened that day that Mr. Red Cross, who was a big man then on, you know, here at Channel 13, he saw me and for some reason decided I should be part of that show. And I said, hey, why not? I thought it was fun. Out of the catalog, they ordered my cowgirl outfit. You can picture this. I was much younger then, of course. And there I was with my boots and dressed as a cowgirl, a ponytail down to here, and I became part of the country carnival with the Smith Brothers.
Several years earlier, another one-time receptionist had made her start in local broadcasting.
I was waiting to be assigned a teacher's position here in Macon. I planned to teach school, and took a temporary job as a receptionist at WMAZ. And along with that, the manager, Al Lowe, suggested that I do a morning program.
And that morning radio show launched a career that included several appearances on national television.
We had a program from New York on the old Dumont network, a dramatic program, 30-minute show. And Del Ward took one of the leading parts in that dramatic sketch. I remember looking at it and being real proud that a Macon young lady was doing television in New York.
In 1957, Del Ward returned to Macon, and she brought to Channel 13 what would turn out to be the longest-running television show in Middle Georgia.
The origin of Date with Del as a program as such started in Indiana at South Bend, and then went with me when I joined WGN in Chicago, and then stayed with me when I returned home and joined Channel 13, radio and television.
Music was a major part of the early programming on Channel 13. They had shows like the Senators Quartet, the Travelers Quartet, the popular Eddie Cannon Show, among others. But probably the single most successful musical program in Georgia television at that time was the Hayloft Jamboree. Now, the man responsible for the success of the Hayloft Jamboree was Gene Stripling. He had started his radio career back in 1937 on WSB radio with a group called the Texas Wranglers. Now, a lot of people may not remember the name Gene Stripling, but if they were watching Channel 13 between 1953 and 1958, then they'll remember the name Uncle Ned.
Ned was so, he was mind-boggling. His talent was so great. He had the largest following. I can remember when he was on radio, how they used to crowd the studio, and they would come every day out to Channel 13, his followers. They really were devoted to him.
He had contacts in the music business that were just incredible. I think everybody that out of Nashville knew Uncle Ned and the Hayloft Jamboree. And as a result, he had a lot of big stars, you know, country music stars, come down and be on the program with him. And I think they all just genuinely liked the man. He had a way of again, being very down to earth without being ungentlemanly. As I think back on Ned, I think he was a great piano player too. You know, I don't know at that time if everybody realized it, because Jerry Lee Lewis and people like that soon became the rage, but Ned was playing that stuff years before they were, jumping up and down on the piano and just rocking everybody out. He was great.
If he could help you, he'd help you. And a lot of times he would do things that people didn't even know about. He would contribute to things, you know, charities, that nobody knew anything about it, but he would do it. And he'd never say anything about it.
He was, again, able to communicate with a camera the way that most people can communicate with another person in their living room. He got his point across. When he wanted to do a commercial, he'd do a commercial. He didn't have anything written down. He didn't memorize anything. He'd just pick it up and talk about it, you know. Hey, Mama, this is good stuff. Go out and buy it. And Mama went out and bought it.
And I'll tell you how popular the man was. It got to the point they had to stand guard over the log every day to keep salesmen from slipping in and putting additional spots in his segment. They had to actually forbid anybody but the traffic manager for doing things to the log because everybody wanted on that show.
He was a great guy to work with. If he was still living, I'd still be working with him. If it's possible.
The night Uncle Ned died, we had a show. Well, we took intermission at 11 o'clock. Well, Uncle Ned went up to the front of the building and propped his leg up on a Coca-Cola box and was standing there talking. And I saw him up there, and I turned around, fixing my music stand with my songs on it, and some lady came up to me and told me, says, Uncle Ned has just had a heart attack. I said, no, ma'am. I said, don't kid about that now. I said, there's some things we don't joke about. She said, I'm not joking. Says, he just had it. So I turned back around, and I didn't see him on the Coca-Cola box. And I saw people going out the door. So I walked out there. And sure enough, that was Uncle Ned in the back of his car, and Pee Wee had his collar open, fanning him, until the ambulance got there. The ambulance come and got him, carried him to Hawkinsville, and that's where he passed away.
I sang at Uncle Ned's funeral, and that was the hardest job I ever tried to do, is to sing at his funeral after being affiliated with him so much throughout the years. And it's kind of hard to sing and shed tears at the same time.
The real strange thing about that, the night when he got ready to leave the station, they did their show and left, and Ned walked out by us at something he had never done, and he reached in his pocket and took out a brand new crisp $1 bill and laid it on the desk in front of me, and he said, don't say that I never did give you anything, and walked out the door, and I never saw him again.
With all of the changes that television has gone through over the years, there is one thing that has stayed with us from the very first day, and that is the television commercial. We'll take a short break now. We'll show you a couple of current versions, and when we come back, we'll find out a little bit about how they were back in those early years.
I got a little something here, ladies, I think maybe you'd be interested in. You know, a lot of times you get trying to fix a meal around the house. You don't know what to fix. You can't decide. You can't make up your mind. Yet at the same time, you know that you and the family and the kids and all need some real delicious green vegetables. You got it right here in this can of Georgia brand turnip greens. And that's just what they are, Georgia turnip greens. They're grown, they're processed, they're canned right here in Georgia by people that know what the story is.
Straight from the heart of Georgia, Channel 13. From the heart of the people, the young folks and the old. Traditions we inherit, stories we've been told. Taking pride in honest labor and saying what we mean. We're coming straight from the heart of Georgia, Channel 13.
Just getting started. Revenue was probably the single element that had the most to do with whether or not the station would succeed. And in television, revenue means commercials.
I guess back in those days, everybody did commercials. Everybody who did air work did commercials. The announcers did, the anchors. They just, you know, really everybody did. And we didn't have today's sophisticated teleprompter, so a lot of it was ad lib.
The worst ones were the ones where you had to open doors, roll out the oven, show that it worked, roll it back in, and I defy you to roll out an oven rack and roll it back in without it going, wow, wow.
The vast majority of commercials came off without a hitch. But on the occasion when there was a mistake, it usually was a beaut.
The very first time that we had a teleprompter, and it was an old wooden monstrosity that ran on a scroll roller system that somebody had to run by hand. And I was doing a commercial for a local clothing store and came running back to my appointed place, and they held up the teleprompter, and the teleprompter was supposed to read, "See this suit I'm wearing? You can have one for $39.95. Shows you what year that was. But instead of saying, "See this suit I'm wearing," there was a typographical error in the word suit, which changed it into an entirely different word.
It was a commercial for a local automobile dealer. It was toward the end of the model year, and I know that you remember the type of commercial.
And my last big line was to have been, "So come to Dunlap Volume Chevrolet for their big year-end sale." And
I turned on the camera, checked the siren level, gave her a go signal.
it came out, "Come on out to Dunlap Volume Chevrolet for their big rear-end sale." Well, I can laugh now, but I think that I wanted to die or to cry or both. I wasn't sure which.
If you love to live dangerously and skate on that fine line, that's where we were in television in those days.
I remember one thing that got a lot of play was when Herb Johnson and Helen Farmer were doing a show together, and they were doing a live commercial. And it was the rage those days, the John Cameron Swayze Timex commercials, you know.
And she was going to show how she could drop this watch into water and take it back out, and everything was fine. But she had set it just before the commercial went on, and didn't get the winding stem all the way back in.
It wasn't running when you put it in there. And of course, yeah, what are you going to do?
This was back before the days of the ultra close-up lens, so the camera was that far away. It could have been running and no one would have known.
But instead of using a little license, I just said, "Oh, it didn't work." Well, the wrath of the commercial sales division came down on me that first week. Well, what? I said, truth always, truth always.
One time I remember Stan Carey, dear man, was doing the weather. And I was standing by to do a commercial where we were selling some trunks, you know, Foot Lockers and things. And one night we had a song from an album by Hugo Montenegro. The album was called Hu-Fi Moods. And the camera came back on Stan, and he said, "That's the weather around the country." And the music tonight was by Monto Hugo Negro, and from the album Fu-Hi Moods. Hi Fu Me. And by this time, the camera was coming up on me to sell the Foot Lockers, which I was now lying across, just paralyzed with laughter, and we never got the commercial on the air.
Often, disaster was averted by quick thinking on the part of the commercial talent.
One of the commercials late one night called for the announcer to get the milk out and pour a glass of the nice, refreshing Boden's milk. When he went in and opened the refrigerator, of course, the cameras are rolling because he's bringing it out. He brings the milk out, and the milk bottle is totally empty. And he ad-libbed real quickly and said, "Well, you see, it's so good that it's gone before I can get my glass."
I know one time, I remember David Reeves and myself supposed to do something in a commercial with some shoes. And we put the boxes of shoes on the table and had the cover on the table and everything, got all into the commercial, pulled the top off to get the shoes out. There are no shoes in the box, just two empty boxes, no shoes at all. So he is holding his hands down, and they panned up off of him, and he did the rest of the commercial, described the shoes and everything about it. And I told him, I said, it's better than looking at the shoes.
He was advertising for Sturkey's Jewelry. He did commercials for Sturkey's for many years. And this is when Timex watches had just come out. And Uncle Ned is shaking that watch and saying, "You know, these things are just totally indestructible." And about that time, the watch slipped out of his hand and flew across the studio and landed on the concrete.
And the camera didn't miss a trick. It followed the watch all the way over. It hit the concrete and smashed into 1,000 pieces. And Uncle Ned said, now see, that's what would have happened had this been a regular watch. But it won't happen with the timings.
Up to that time, WMAZ radio had built quite a reputation in broadcast news. Naturally, when WMAZ TV went on the air, it was to have news as well. The problem was that, like many other areas of the station's operation, there just wasn't anybody there that had ever done it before.
There was great competition in radio news at that particular time. All the radio stations in Macon were doing news. Channel 13 was the only TV station, so all your emphasis was put in radio news, and television newscast was basically a repeat of the radio newscast with a few pieces of film and still pictures and things like that.
We produced a television newscast, and this, of course, was well before the days of tape, cameras, but all of our reporters carried Polaroid cameras. And when we had a picture of something, it was a Polaroid. It was basically a radio newscast with Polaroid pictures for the first year or two, and then we moved from there into 35 millimeters and this type of thing.
There. But the big news department itself was downtown. We didn't even have really a big news department out at the TV station. We had a couple of desks there, and 3 or 4 people would come and put this thing together. That's the way it all started.
We use what they refer to as rear screen projection, and they would have a picture of an announcer behind and the news would actually be audio that was going straight to the control room from downtown radio news department. And that was where you got a lot of your local stories that way. You just run a picture of the announcer and him just sitting there not saying anything. He was just his picture and the audio coming from downtown there.
I remember before we went to fully to color news film, we would shoot features in color just to show that we could do color and we could project color for those few people who had a color television set at the time. And in effect, we would shoot our color film features, take them to the drugstore, send them to Atlanta to have them processed. Actually, that's the truth.
A lot can be learned about any business by looking at the men in charge, and that's true of Channel 13. When we come back, we'll take a look at 3 rather extraordinary individuals whose unique personalities and talents combined to assure the success of Channel 13.
Well, howdy, kids. It's refreshment time, and that brings up a mighty interesting subject today, Borden's ice cream. And we've got it in these wonderful, great, big half-gallon packages that you see stacked over here. Now, why do we say get it in the half-gallon package? Well, I'll tell you very simply. It's so you'll always have plenty on hand anytime you want ice cream. You can use it for a number of things, you know, sodas, fundies, spread it on cake, or just eat it plain by itself. Of course.
When plans began for Middle Georgia's first VHF television station, there was some concern about the unlucky image of the number 13. The decision was made to take a humorous approach to Lucky 13 and to adopt a black cat as the station's symbol, and so staff artist Carolyn McMillan created this little fella, TV the Cat, who went on to represent the station for over 20 years. It's part of the history of Channel 13 and Middle Georgia. 35 years together, straight from the heart.
13 was guided by a team of 3 men, each one totally different from the others, but who together formed a management structure that would assure the success of the station. Wilton Cobb, who was involved in the very beginnings of WMAZ radio, held the position at Channel 13 of general manager.
Mr. Cobb was a very fine man, and everyone always got the impression that he was enjoying all of this as much as the employees were. He felt that he was learning along with us, and that's a great feeling to have from an employer.
he would be listening and watching when you least expected it, and then would call you and tell you what you had done wrong. Sometimes he would call and tell you what he liked, what had gone right in his opinion.
We had a private line in the newsroom, and at 7:13 every night, the telephone would ring religiously, and it would be Mr. Cobb. And Mr. Cobb would say, why did he call so-and-so so-and-so? And why didn't you use this story? And why did you use that story instead of the other story? We got a nightly critique on the news from Mr. Cobb. And I will say this in all honesty, it was very helpful, because he was a good newsman, and he also cared about the news.
I can remember one time when Mr. Cobb actually changed the word in Webster's dictionary. He said, by golly, this is the way we would say it.
Mr. Cobb, for instance, insisted that the town west of here in Bibb County was called Lizella.
He said it was named for Lizzie and it was named for Ella, two daughters of a famous man, and he didn't want anybody on WMAZ to call it Lizella again. It was Lizella.
He called me once and he said, I'm surprised at you. The suit is not worsted, it's worsted. From then on, it was worsted to me, buddy. Another time he called and said, the car is not a coupe, it's a coupe. And from then on, it was a coupe.
He also said that there's no such thing as a cow in Moscow. And he said that's the most obstinate bovine in the history of man, is the cow in Moscow. It's Moscow.
We could not refer to a building being gutted by fire, because Mr. Cobb felt that gutted was crude and that it would shock some of our viewers, so we didn't say gutted. And we could not use the word rape on the air, because this was a shocking thing to say for television. The children might hear it. So you referred to, if you had a police case involving a rape, you referred to it as a criminal assault. And then a gentleman by the name of W.H. Pip Rape was named police chief in Warner Robins. And Howard Absalom, the news director at the time, wrote a note to Mr. Cobb. He said, Mr. Cobb said, may we refer to the Warner Robins police chief as W.H. Pip Rape on our newscast, or will it be necessary to refer to him as Warner Robins police chief W.H. Pip criminal assault? And he never got a response from Mr. Cobb.
Frank Crowther was usually remembered by the name Red Cross. He was officially the station's sales manager, but in reality, his influence spread to almost every area of the station's operation.
Everybody lived in fear, total fear of Red Cross. And as I look back, I think Red Cross knew it and loved it, because he took every opportunity to put you through the ringer if he could, in a kind of a teasing way.
He believed in his convictions. You couldn't change Red Cross, and he made up his mind for something. That's what he wanted, and he wanted nothing short of that.
Red Cross was a taskmaster, and he was frightening, and everybody in broadcasting should have schooled under him, because he knew what it was all about, and he listened, and nobody could figure out how he could listen to AM, FM, and television all at the same time. But if you made a mistake, he knew it. So you had to be on your toes all the time. And
the easiest way to get along with him is if you made the slightest mistake, phone him up at home even and tell him, I did this. I made this mistake. And you never heard a word more about it. He was very easy to get along with, as long as you were 100% totally honest with him on everything. But don't ever try to act like it happened this way when it happened this way. And you got along with him fine.
What was not known by many of those people was the man's big heart. Just a few years before he got out of the business, Mr. Cross was on paper for about 6 or 7 employees with whom he co-signed so that they could build a home. And not many people knew that. He cared deeply for the employees.
His mind was a veritable fountain of ideas. He could
you'd sit there and talk to him a few minutes, and he'd come up with 6 ways that you could do this, or 3 ways that you shouldn't do this.
I can hear him right now. When you called him, the second ring of the telephone, he said cross, and the next thing you would hear be a Zippo lighter, light a cigarette.
But I have been in the office several times, and he'd have a couple of cigarettes on there burning on his ashtray and one in his hand. He'd just swap them back and forth. He'd light one with another one. Once he gets through with his cigarette, he'd light it.
I remember when I made the appointment to get the job at Channel 13, and I never will forget the man. He was a chain smoker, always had him, and held him in a very strange way. Well, I've seen you on the air. You do a reasonably creditable job. When can you start? And my heart just was pounding in my chest. I remember one time he told us at a meeting, he said, I want you all to read up a little bit on the things you're talking about. If you're going to be talking about music, read up on the music. You go on the air, you call it a fugue. It's not a fug, it's a fugue. You got to read up on these things.
The third member of this management team was George P. Rankin, Jr. Now, he was one of the key people responsible for the actual creation of WMAZ radio in 1922. It was actually a physics project of Mercer University. And in fact, in 1927, he became the first paid employee of the radio station when it was operated by the Macon JCs. But by 1953, George P. Rankin had become the majority owner of the station. But those who remember him are quick to point out that most of the time he maintained a surprisingly low profile.
Oh, what a wonderful man, very quiet, unassuming person. I had first come to work out there at the TV station, and we'd work every other Saturday morning to answer the phones, every other Saturday morning. So I was out there this one Saturday morning, and I was brand new. Now, maybe I'd been there 3 or 4 months, and I had never seen Mr. Rankin. So there I am at the front desk, and this man came in in work overalls, you know, work shirt, and came in and said, good morning. And I said, good morning, sir, can I help you? And he said, oh, I'm just going back there in engineering. I said, I'm sorry, sir, but you can't go back there. And he said, oh. I said, if tell me who you want to see, I'll get him out here. And so this is the kind of wonderful man he was. He said, just call back there and tell them Mr. George Rankin is here. And I looked up and I said, oh, Mr. Rankin. And he said, there, you didn't know. I knew after that.
The first time I saw George Rankin, and for those who remember George Rankin and the image that he projected, you can understand this. I had no idea who the man was, and I thought he was making deliveries to the TV station, and he pulled up to the front door, and I told him to go around the back and go in the engineering department because we didn't take deliveries there.
We had an announcer, and back in the radio days, who was new to Macon, had come in, and he was, one Saturday morning, he was on the air. And Mr. Rankin, of course, was an engineer. Mr. George went in there and was working on the tape decks and in the control room and making a little noise, and Herb finally looked around and said, fella, said, I'm on the air, you just gonna have to get out of here. Said, you making too much noise, said, you messing up the program. So Mr. George went out, went on back in his office. I came in a few minutes later, and Herb said, who's that fellow? Was in here with those khaki pants and that work shirt on, back here messing with the tape recorder. He said, he's making noise. I said, I told him to get out. I said, that's the fellow that owns the station. He said, oh, my Lord. So I went and got Mr. George and took him in and introduced him, and he started apologizing. Mr. George said, no, you did right. I shouldn't have been in here making noise. And that was just the sort of a guy he was. He was real down to earth, real down to earth.
We'd have a staff meeting or a general manager's meeting of the higher-ups, and Mr. Cobb and Mr. Rankin and Mr. Cross and some of the top officials would work for the company, and they would discuss some project that they had in mind of doing, and they couldn't get together on it, and they began to argue. Mr. Rankin wouldn't say a word, you just get up and leave. No, that was it. Then they'd work out the things later to get back to him, and they'd settle it, but if they get any kind of disagreement come up, he just get up and leave. Just say, we'll do it this way. When he could have just called the shots, but he wouldn't do it, he just get up and leave.
There were, however, some occasions when he would exercise his authority, and when he did, it could be chiseled in stone.
He very seldom ever had anything to say about the daily operation of the station, but when he spoke, everybody listened, and the changes were made according to what he said, that he had the ultimate decision on everything.
Back in the early days, if he saw something he didn't like in the state, he'd just shut it down, take it off of the air, and fix it. And Wilson had an awful time keeping him from doing that. Because any time, day or night, if he saw something was going wrong, he'd just fix it right then. He'd shut it down. But Mr. Rankin, he lived and breathed electronics all of his life. And he wanted something. Now, he really wanted it, and you had to get busy and call people and get it in here because he didn't have much patience waiting to get it.
When the AM station went to 50,000 watts, they started using the phrase, the Big 50. He walked in one day, I don't want to ever hear that again. We don't promote ourselves. If the public doesn't know how good we are, we don't want to promote it. Don't ever say that again over the air. That he didn't like to push himself in the public. His opinion, the public will find out how good you are without you telling them.
In the early days of FM, before WMAZ had an FM, he opted for one. And there was some question about this in the minds of a lot of people. What are you going to do with it? How will we program it? What's it going to do? He said, just take it and whatever you're running on AM, run the same thing on FM. And someday, the FM will be worth it. And, of course, we see the truth in that today.
He was a steel trap when it came to making a decision. And then when he made up his mind, you didn't mention it again.
Although he was probably about my age today, maybe just a little bit younger when they went on the air, or when we went on the air, he climbed to the top of the tower himself and took a wrench and made sure that the bolts to the antenna were tight enough.
He talked engineering all the time, and then when he wasn't talking engineering, he was on an amateur radio station out at his home.
In fact, it was this interest in ham radio that had indirectly gotten Mr. George interested in television in the first place.
He was not interested at all in TV. None. Wouldn't have one. And people would start calling him, calling our house and saying, oh, Mr. Rankin, oh, George, I just heard you on your radio, ham radio. That was it now, y'all, ham radio. And that upset him greatly. See, they heard him on that TV sets. So we had to screen it all out. So he went and rented a little TV set, just a tiny one. And we put it in this dining room away from his ham radio. And I would stand there and tell him when it was doing thus and so, when the lines were this way or that way, and so forth. I don't remember exactly how the signs were, but I would tell him, and so he'd change it. And he phased all the way around the whole circumference of that ham radio so that nobody could hear it coming through and, you know, distracting them. He began looking at that little TV set, just for that reason. The next thing I knew, he was bringing in a larger TV set. And the next thing I knew, he was sold on TV.
About 35 years earlier, while serving in the World War I Merchant Marine, George Rankin made one decision that otherwise could have affected the very existence of WMAZ radio and Channel 13.
And he was on the SS Princess Matoika, and Captain Pratt was head of the ship. And they went across the waters 18 times. And on the 19th time, it was Christmas time. And George had decided to go home to see his family. But Captain Pratt wanted him to stay right on and go on this one more trip the 19th trip, and then go home. But he was insistent, and he may have been led by higher powers, a higher power, because he went home instead, because that ship went down and they've never heard of it since. Everybody was lost.
That same higher power may have stepped in several years later when Rankin set about to install a 5-tower directional transmission system for WMAZ AM. Now, it was a job that most experts said wouldn't be possible, and at one point, after failing to make the system work, a consultant from Washington suggested that they abandon the project.
And he left this man and probably didn't say a word and went over under one of those towers, went a good little distance, because you know they're far apart. And he knelt and prayed, and he said, Lord, we've done the best we can. Now, what can we do about this trouble? And the words came to him, phase number 1 tower. Now, you may know what that means, and but I don't. So George came back, and he said, we're going to phase number 1 tower. They phased it, and it went to work just like that.
In those early years, just like today, there's a lot that goes on behind the camera that most of the time viewers aren't even aware of. And we'll be back in just a minute to hear about that. Stay with us.
More news and pictures from the Middle Georgia area in just a moment. But the question now is, are you and your car ready for winter? Remember, you're set, you're safe, you're sure with Crestone Antifreeze, and the place to get it, my friends, is at your Trisoil Sinclair dealers. Those are statements of fact, and by way of advice, we say that you should get that Crestone now. It'll be too late after a hard freeze, you know. Drive by that Trisoil Sinclair station.
1958, after just 5 years on the air, Channel 13 asked its viewers to vote by mail for their favorite shows, and over 81,000 Middle Georgians sent in their ballots. The winners? Well, the top 3 local shows were Vesper Time with Jimmy Waters, the Hayloft Jamboree, and a 1-year-old show called Date with Dell, which is still going strong. By the way, the top 3 network shows were Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, and a game show called Name That Tune. It's all part of the history of Channel 13 and Middle Georgia. 35 years together, straight from the heart.
Television that hasn't changed much is the amount of effort and the number of people that it took to put on any type of TV show. And whether it was in the studio or out on remote, what the viewers saw on the screen didn't always reflect exactly what was going on behind the camera. And sometimes, like the old saying goes, whatever can happen, will.
I think one of the best stories is we had a cameraman whose name was Jewel McGee, who was up on the roof as we were shooting a live wrestling sequence out in the parking lot.
And all of a sudden I noticed the camera on the roof just pan around on the ground and up in the sky, and it wasn't shooting nothing. And I kept calling Jewel on the headphone. I said, Jewel, I said, what's happening, bro? What's going on? I couldn't get no response. So finally I asked one of the people down on the ground, I said, what's happened to Jewel up there? He's got his headset off throwing at the wrestler, so he got consumed in the wrestler, then was picking up gravel off the roof and throwing it at the wrestlers. I said, well, let's take care of him. We ought to give him something else to do next time.
We'd rehearse as much as we could some of these shows we were doing, but you got to remember we were doing one a day and doing other things before and after, and it didn't leave much rehearsal time. And as a result, once in a while, you'd rehearse a thing one way, and it would come out another way.
It was a dance show. I can't remember the name of the dance show. But anyway, we had rehearsed this show, and the dancer was, he was supposed to be ballet, I believe is what the dance was supposed to be. And he's in the corner of the screen, in the studio. The lights hit him, and the music was supposed to have been some kind of ballet music. And the audio man who was playing the music had gotten the wrong music, and he played the Orange Blossom Special. And this, the talent, whoever it was, just really jumped into it. I mean, he just did the whole 9 yards. You would have thought it was right if you hadn't known there were, you know.
I remember David Reeves did a midday program, and just before he went on one day, David was always leaping around in and out of he didn't open a convertible door to get out. He leaped out of it, you know. And just before his show began, he split the entire back of his pants out. And the show was ready to go. It was live, and David had to back all around the set that day to keep from being seen.
One of the funniest to us was back when our 6 o'clock news was sponsored by Atlanta Gas Light. And we had 2 desks on rolling dollies that were rather high, I guess about 1.5 feet high off the floor.
Roy Hubbard, who was a newscaster in those days, had finished a newscast and was sitting in a chair that had no back on it.
And Roy finished his newscast and shuffled his papers and glanced in the monitor and saw he was still on the air and shuffled his papers some more and picked up his pen and put it in his pocket and shuffled his papers some more. And I guess he figured, well, these papers are shuffled now, so he pushed his chair back to get up from the desk, and the chair and the desk were on a dolly about this high. And the back legs of the chair went off, and all you saw was Roy's feet up in the air for the rest of the long good night. I'm sure it seemed like an hour to Roy.
I don't think he was hurt. His dignity was scorched.
So there it is. As much of the story as we can really tell in 60 minutes. But for every person that we saw or heard in the last hour, there were probably 100 more whose hard work and dedication over the years helped to lay the foundation for the success that Channel 13 enjoys even today. And we thank them all. I'm Aaron Bowers. Good night.